be Saturday. It's July 27th, 2024, and you are listening to Morning Meeting. I'm Ashley Baker in London.
And I'm Michael Haney in New York City.
And we are two of your airmail editors here to make sense of the news. And in short, Michael, what a week it has been. The Olympics are underway in Paris, which is very exciting. Meanwhile, in the U.S., turns out we have a new presidential candidate this week, as the entire world knows. The Democrats are feverishly working to ensure that Kamala Harris has as good of a chance as possible against Donald Trump. She's been breaking fundraising records left and right, and there's definitely a sense of optimism in that realm. But meanwhile, in the UK, we have a new Labour government that's been rolling out lots of exciting-ish new initiatives. And there's been one especially shocking report, Michael, that the Conservatives spent nearly $1 billion on the Rwanda scheme to deport migrants there. And that included payments to the Kigali government, flights that never took off, the cost of detaining hundreds of people. By the time that Rishi Sunak left office, only 4 people had been sent to Rwanda. And that's probably because they were paid £3,000 or about $5,000 to do so. As usual, Airmail is the antidote to all of that distressing news.
Yeah, and we have a wonderful show packed with fascinating conversations and great insight. First, our colleague Jensen Davis will join us to tell us why the hashtag toxic tampons is seemingly everywhere on social media and what it means for women. Then, we have a terrific story courtesy of Alan Cowell, a longtime correspondent for the New York Times. Cowell will tell us about a rather curious distinction he holds. In particular, he is the last correspondent to file a war zone dispatch via carrier pigeon. Where was it? When? Cowell will share all. And finally, speaking of carriers, our own Harrison Vale is here with a story about carriers of a different sort and what they say about us. We're talking about the media-branded tote bag. And as summer hits high season and the global smart set decamps to Martha's Vineyard, the Amalfi Coast, or maybe Jeff Bezos' yacht, Harrison is going to tell us what these totes say about the person who carries them. So Ashley, where would you like to begin today?
Let's start with the department, Michael, of That Was Then. Let's bring Alan Cowell on here to explain what it used to be like when you would file dispatches via carrier pigeon. Alan is a former New York Times foreign correspondent who's currently working on a new novel called The Obituarist. Welcome, Alan.
Hi, it's good to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. So, Alan, before we get to the story, before satellite phones, before cell phones, before smartphones or any phones, there was a little something called the carrier pigeon, but we're going to get to that in a moment because I want to know, before we get to carrier pigeons and your experience with them, what made you think about them?
Well, I think partly at that time I worked for the Reuters news agency, which had been founded in 1850 or achieved great competitive success in 1850 by using carrier pigeons in Europe to bridge a gap in what was the telegraph circuit to get news between Germany and Britain and via Brussels. And the founder of Reuters, Baron Julius Reuter, came on the great idea of using carrier pigeons. And ever since then, I think successive generations of Reuters correspondents thought that it was part of our DNA to have some familiarity with avian communications.
Yeah, these days you get trained in how to use Zoom and other things for linking. But so take us back to, this is late 70s, and tell us about how you then came to get, I guess, familiarity with carrier pigeons.
Well, the owner of the pigeons, or the pigeon fancier, was a man called Alderman Sid Miller, who was a councillor in Bulawayo in Zimbabwe in southern Africa. And he instructed me and a couple of colleagues in the art of deftly writing as much as we could on a small piece of paper, scrunching that up, putting it into a canister on the bird's leg, holding the bird's leg between your index and middle finger, your thumb over the wing, giving it a little peck on the head for reasons I never quite understood, and then lofting it upwards so that it would return from wherever you were to the loft where the alderman kept his pigeons. And from there, courier or a runner would take it to the newsroom of the Bulawayo Chronicle, the local newspaper. And from there, it would be transmitted by hook or by crook to the Reuters bureau in Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe. And from there, it went to Johannesburg. And from there, it went to London. And from there, it went to the world.
Just to note, you were in Zimbabwe. It was 1979, 1980, and you were, as you note in your wonderful story this week, you were covering the ceasefire preceding the elections and the independence. And so there'd been a long Bush war that had gone on. But of course, like, you get there to cover it, and there's no link except for these carrier pigeons.
True, there was absolutely nothing. It was a very, very remote area. There was maybe a village nearby, but they didn't have landlines or anything. And we were accompanying or embedded with New Zealand Special Forces because it was a Commonwealth operation, and they wouldn't give us access to their radios because they thought that the press and the military should keep a distance from each other, which I agreed with. So then after that, we had no option. The only other way to have done it would have been to wait until news broke and then get back into our armor-plated Land Rover, rumble back through the savannah to Bulawayo to find communications there. So this was much closer to instant communications and probably easier to master than modern communications, if I might say so.
Alan and I have had we've had a little challenge today getting logged on here. The pigeons were kind of like the Starlink or the internet of the day, really. They were, but as you say, a little more dependable. They just needed a little bird feed and kiss on. So what was this kiss on the head that you had to give them before you sent them aloft? Is this really what is part of the training?
Well, it was part of our training. I'm not sure it was part of the birds' training. It might have left them feeling slightly bewildered with its species affection, but I was assured that it was what they were used to. And what I wasn't told at the time was that they like to travel in pairs, of course.
Right. So as you reveal in your story, I mean, the first, I should say, maybe feathered dispatch you sent out, you released, he just sat in a tree and you wondered, why is he not moving, right?
Yeah, it was baffling. And so because we were writing these dispatches, infrequent though they were, on small pieces of tissue paper from the inside of a 30-pack of local cigarettes, you had to rewrite the whole thing and try and remember it. And you could just about get 400 words on one piece of paper, and you could just about get that piece of paper into the canister that you taped to the bird's leg. So it was a laborious business. It wasn't just pressing a button and repeating it the way we do these days.
And to be clear, Alan, you were writing that out by hand on that little piece of cigarette paper, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You just want to make sure you don't actually then take that and turn it into a cigarette while you're working and have your work go up in flames.
No, but we must have smoked an awful lot of cigarettes during that era because I don't think we ever ran out of paper to write our dispatches on.
So when you look back on that period, what do you make of all that? You're sort of like the last moment when something like this was happening. As you say, you were the last foreign correspondent to do this, right?
The last Reuters correspondent known to have done this, yes, absolutely. We were still really in the era of telex machines, and which are just as sort of abstruse a concept for a lot of people as pigeons are. But it was several years later, when maybe 5 years later, we were moved into very basic laptops, and there was no internet, of course, and electronic filing, electronic storyfying was all done really very, very on an ad hoc basis. You would do various things that enabled you to tap into the phone contact connections in a hotel room and then get the mouthpiece from the phone into a kind of clock that would then detect a carrier signal, carrier pigeons, enable you to send it. But compared to what we do these days, I mean, a telex machine would take about half an hour to transmit 800 words. These days, in a nanosecond, you can transmit infinite numbers of words and huge amounts of data. So it was a completely different era. And historically, it was part of a huge change that happened in Southern Africa when the last vestiges of colonial or white minority rule were being wiped off the continent. And so in 75, you'd had independence in the Portuguese colonies of Mozambique and Angola. This was 79. 80 Robert Mugabe came to power in Zimbabwe. And that was all a prelude to what happened then in South Africa with eventually the release of Nelson Mandela and elections and a democracy for the first time. So it was a historic period. And this, I guess, was a part of the history of journalism, that communications weren't always as simple as they are now, or sometimes are now. And they're certainly not as fast, and they're certainly more laborious. And I will very rarely would give my smartphone a kiss on the head before I started sending stories from it.
Yeah, I think nowadays we're more likely to curse at our cell phones. Alan, I'm just struck listening and your perspective. There was a time back then, I'm sure we were like, there was the rush on Fleet Street to sort of get the scoop first, beat the competition, right? Speed, speed, speed in this era when it was all so analog. And now, of course, speed, it's like this, right? But what do you think we've lost anything in reporting and writing because the speed is so easy now, or do you think it's all for the better? In other words, having that chance to sort of like reflect a little bit and have to wait. Do you think that we've lost anything?
I think one spent a lot more time on the technicalities. I mean, to send a story from a telex machine, you had to punch paper tape, ticker tape, and run it through the machine, and it would plank its way through, and if it didn't go the first time, you sent it the second time. So I don't think that, because competitiveness has always been there, and I was quite furious. But the difference was, of course, that if you saw something, if you saw a photograph, if someone told you something, you were much more likely to, after the right checks, of course, believe what you've been told. There wasn't a question of fake news. There were no pigeons generated by artificial intelligence. The birds were real, beating hearts in your hand, and the stories were real. When we got a story finally in this very remote encampment, it was when a young man in military fatigues came in and said he was an advance guard for 400 freedom fighters, and he was a real living human being. It wasn't a notional thing at all. In fact, he said he was very hungry, and at that point, one of our birds cooed, and he looked quite peckish for a moment, and we had to dissuade him with our supplies of canned food from wondering whether the communications could be served up as dinner.
Well, Alan, it's an absolutely delightful and revealing and just terrific story, a piece of history and a way of reporting and writing that doesn't exist anymore. But your brilliant story this week, your lovely story this week, recommended for everyone, and really grateful to you for making time to share your remembrances of it.
Well, thank you very much for your interest. It's been a very good experience for me to remember those days, so thank you.
Michael, doesn't life seem like it used to be so quaint?
So quaint. And not just quaint, but I think part of the quaintness was it moved at a different pace. It moved at the pace of a pigeon.
Yeah, and there are optimism and moments of charm even in war zones.
I mean, now you've got to deal with, I can't get the Zoom link to work. Back then, I didn't kiss him on the head properly, and he didn't fly away the right way. So I don't know, different tech glitches in different ways.
Well, speaking of war zones, let's go onto the interwebs and figure out what exactly is happening in the wild west of TikTok. Jensen Davis, a senior editor here at Airmail, is here to explain why a recent study on tampons and the metals contained within has got the internet in a flutter. Welcome, Jensen.
Good morning.
So, Jensen, there's a new study about so-called toxic chemicals in tampons that has the internet all aflutter and a Twitter. What exactly does the study tell us, if anything?
So, researchers at UC Berkeley and Columbia just published a study in the end of June that was looking at metals in tampons because there have not been really any studies into what chemicals are found in tampons. And they tested for 16 metals in 14 different tampon brands. They tested a bunch of different versions of tampons from different brands, but they found all 16 metals they tested for across the tampon brands and 12 of the metals in every single tampon tested.
But Jensen, do we know if these metals are able to leach out of the tampons into someone's body?
So the study only tested to see if the metals were present. There has not been a lot of research into tampons, even though women have been using them since the 1930s. So right now, the people that did the study are trying to see if the metals in the tampons can actually enter a woman's bloodstream. They're not sure if the metals come out of the tampon. All they know now is that the metals are present in the tampons.
Yeah, and I think we should, as a caveat for listeners, scientists have cautioned that the levels found in tampons were extremely low and not what some experts would consider to be harmful, right?
Well, that's an open question. I spoke to some of the researchers involved with the study, and they seemed reasonably concerned. They're saying that there's still a lot of questions out. They don't know if the metal comes out of the tampon, But some of the metals found, like arsenic and lead, are considered toxic in any amount, where others, such as zinc, we need zinc, but it's a matter of how much zinc we're exposed to. But some scientists that I talked to who are not involved in the study are saying they're not concerned about the amount of lead found.
We're not scientists, so we'll stop with this part of the conversation. But what has this study done to the TikTok universe?
So I found out about this study as unfortunately I find out about a lot of things on TikTok. My For You page is just flooded with videos of women saying hashtag toxic tampons, hashtag no tampons, hashtag free bleeding. Women are really, really upset about this study and are taking videos of themselves at grocery stores, at the menstrual product aisles, pointing at the tampon saying, this is toxic, this is poison. Women are taking videos in their bathrooms, throwing away all of their tampons. So the women of TikTok are very upset.
What are the alternatives, Jensen, for those who don't want to use tampons?
So on TikTok, hashtag DIY pads is also becoming very popular. So some women are suggesting that you make your own pads so that you can know what is in it, which is not exactly true because you don't know what's in the fabric you're using. Some women are using menstrual cups. So it's like a reusable cup that you put in your cervix and it collects the blood. One of the researchers who did the metal study pointed out to me that the chemicals in those cups also haven't been tested. So you don't really know what's in those either. It's supposed to be medical grade silicone, but who knows? Other women are saying that you should free bleed. You use nothing. You just, bleed freely.
Jensen, can I ask a question? You mentioned that tampons have basically been available since the 1930s, almost 100 years now. Have they never been tested? If so, why not? And are they not regulated? Is this really the first time that anyone sort of thought to look into chemicals in them?
So the FDA doesn't make tampon companies regularly test for what chemicals are in the products because it's not like they're adding lead in the tampons for fun. They don't exactly know why these metals are in the tampons. It could be because tampons are made of cotton and there are certain fertilizers or things in the soil. The researchers I talked to said that one of them has been interested in testing the chemicals found in tampons for a decade, but it's been really hard to get funding to do these studies.
Do you have any sense if the results of this test have gotten attention of anyone that's going to call for more research on this, or has that conversation on social media sort of rippled up to FDA and people like that?
Well, the FDA did end up commenting on the study saying, we do what we're supposed to do, everybody calm down, which they kind of have to just say that. But the people that have done the metal study this is actually just the first in a long line of studies about the chemicals found in tampons. They started with metals because Columbia has a really good metals lab. So there are more studies coming, and they are also now studying if the metal comes out of the tampon when a woman is using it. So this is just the first in many, which we will all see on TikTok.
Jensen, have we heard anything from any of the tampon companies? Have they made any statements in either direction on this?
Some of the organic tampon companies have released statements being like they're looking into it, or we have tested our tampons and there's no lead, which it's a little complicated to test for all of those metals. So I'm not sure if they're testing for every metal. But a lot of the major companies have actually not released statements. And I think it's a matter of, I'm sure their legal team is telling them to stay quiet and not wade in on TikTok.
Yeah, fair enough. This kind of reminds me of that. Remember, Jensen, a few years ago, there was a big conversation around Thinks, which were the period underwear, that they were found to have some levels of kind of toxic chemicals. And then that conversation, interestingly enough, kind of faded away. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do remember that. There have actually, some of the scientists I talked to, I was like, why do you think this is taking off on TikTok in the way it is? Because it's truly, I can't go on TikTok for more than 30 seconds without being fed a video about this. That said, I looked it up to write this story. So TikTok also knows that they know me. But there have been, some of the scientists were there have actually been studies about chemicals that are way more concerning than these metals might be about like PFAS or forever chemicals that have been found. And it did not take off on TikTok in the same way. Some of the researchers I talked to were like, yeah, we didn't expect it to go viral. It's good that people are concerned about it, but it's not necessarily the most concerning study about tampons that has come out in the past decade.
Jensen, thank you so much for illuminating us.
Thank you for having me on the podcast.
Michael, aren't you glad you're not a woman?
Once again, it sort of mystifies me that something so elemental to more than 50% of the population seems to have evaded any sort of complete testing. So it's a great story and I encourage everyone to read it.
Yeah, my takeaway from that is trust nobody, trust nothing. Hooray. Well, let's move on to some lighter matters. Harrison Vale, the communications director at Airmail, is a canny social observer, and he's here to tell us all about what your canvas tote says about you. Welcome, Harrison.
Hello, hello.
Okay, so Harrison, in our universe, the It bag is not something from one of these storied luxury houses. It is, in fact, a tote emblazoned with the name of your favorite media company. And you have unpacked all of these for us and told us exactly what they mean. So let's first start with the Airmail tote, which for you and Michael, as well as myself, it just means we work at Airmail, but we have to make fun of ourselves first. So what does the Airmail tote, which you can purchase online at airmail.news/shop, what does it mean about us?
I'm so glad you brought that up and started with this one because it is, of course, my favorite, naturally. And you're right, we are privileged in that as we work at Airmail, this is just sort of a natural accessory that we use. But I think to kick it off, there is something that the Airmail tote represents that a lot of others do not do. I think that if you have an Airmail tote, I like to think of it as sort of the beat up Birkin of the tote ecosystem. And for those of you who are in the know, the beat up Birkin was sort of popularized by the Olsen twins who carried around these horribly scuffed Birkin bags that they probably had for the better part of 15 years. In my mind, the Airmail tote is that. You very likely have some kind of unplaceable accent. You probably spend a lot of time in the London Heathrow JFK corridor. Your passport holder, though it is Hermes, does not have your initials on it, monogram, because there is not enough space. You probably have like some sort of P.G. Wodehouse novel that's all dog-eared in there and lots of beach sand from Patmos or the Hamptons or something.
Harrison, I did take issue with one thing. It says that you've got a copy of Paris Match. Fine, but also a copy of Private Eye, okay?
Also, obviously, a copy of Private Eye, of course.
Thank you. Okay, let's talk about a classic, especially in New York City, the NPR tote. How should we interpret that?
These ones I think are quite funny. There are some of the totes that, when you think about them, they actually have a sort of generational bent to them and help sort of categorize the wearer of this tote in a certain generation. I think NPR is one of those. I don't know personally a lot of people who would identify as Gen Z. I imagine there are not a ton of them who are listening to NPR. So in my mind, this person probably lives on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, probably also has some sort of home in Litchfield County, Connecticut, or probably the Berkshires. They probably have been to the Mount. Maybe they even got married at the Mount, which for those who don't know is Edith Wharton's family home in the Berkshires. They know how to pronounce Satirius Johnson, for example. They are faithful listeners every morning to WNYC or one of the other affiliates, and they can probably rattle off every 60 Minutes anchor, and probably from 1997.
God bless. Okay, the Paris Review. Now, I think Michael and I should get extra credit because our Paris Review totes date back to the George Plimpton days. The newfangled version, what does that mean?
It's a good question. I feel like this is the kind of tote that you wear if you're relatively new to New York, probably, and you found yourself likely during COVID at one of the Paris Review storied office parties, which I'm told no longer really happen. I mean, I invite listeners to maybe correct the record on that, or perhaps their annual spring revel party, which is their big one, where the gift bag comes in the form of a Paris Review tote. I've had the chance to attend one in a past life, and it's a fabulous bag. It's sturdy, it's hefty, it can probably carry upwards of 25 pounds or something like that. And often in that gift bag, they do have some fun little like Aesop hand creams and assorted goodies. So that one, you've probably finagled your way into one of those parties and nabbed a bag on your way out. And you probably style yourself as having some sort of literary sensibility. You're probably devastated and posted about Joan Didion's tragic passing a couple of years ago, but you probably have no idea who George Plimpton actually is.
Okay, hilarious. All right, what about the New Yorker?
The New Yorker, yes. This one is a classic. And this one is probably one that you see most often in the wild. I like to think of it as the old faithful of the tote world, much like a Subaru, if you will, or perhaps even our dear President Joe Biden 10 years ago. I feel like this one splits the difference a little bit. You're probably like aspirationally middle class. I feel like you might live in Williamsburg and probably still go to SoulCycle, but maybe like haven't quite gotten the memo that both are not quite what they used to be. In my mind, again, this sort of splits generationally where you're either too young to have voted in 2016, but are still really proud that you read the New Yorker. But if you did vote in 2016, you would have voted for Hillary, or you're even too old to remember where you put the New Yorker tote in the first place.
Okay, technically A24, not a media company, but you've included it in the list. Why?
It's a great question. I don't know. In my mind, when I was thinking about the different totes that you see out there in the wild on the streets of New York or LA, the A24 guy or girl is definitely a type. And the fact that they are wearing an accessory that brandishes to the world that they are an A24 fan means they're into the kind of like indie sleaze of it all. Have seen the latest. They have a very active Letterboxd account. Probably, I would caution anyone who sees an A24 wearer in the wild not to mention Francis Ford Coppola, especially his latest film, Megalopolis, which got kind of controversial reviews at Cannes this past year. I feel like this is the type of person who has been to Cannes, but to Cannes Lions. And I know I'm really splitting hairs here, but for those listeners who don't know, there is, of course, the Cannes Film Festival, which is the zenith of the cinema world, if you will, that takes place every year in the south of France. But there's also an advertising and marketing festival that takes place later on in the summer. And I feel like this person has probably been to Cannes, but probably Cannes Lions and not the Cannes Film Festival. And probably this person works at Meta, honestly, and feels that the A24 affiliation brings them some sort of cultural clout.
I like that you included A24 Harrison, because I feel like it's a little bit of the if you know kind of tote that sort of, as we've gone through some of these, you know the brand, you see the logo. And this one is a little bit more of like cultural dog whistle, maybe signaling I'm supposed to be more cool than you don't really know this is, which sort of leads me to the next one that I'm sure Ashley wants to know about is How Long Gone, which is so subtle. It's like you got to really know to know, right?
Talk about the cultural dog whistle par excellence. I think that the How Long Gone one is a real if you know, you know. And for all those listeners who aren't familiar with How Long Gone, I suggest you go Google and listen immediately. This one is one that's just hard to get your hands on, ultimately. I have the feeling that they're kind of always sold out. I personally don't have one. I'm dying to get my hands on one. It looks both sturdy and has that very famous How Long Gone colorway of the blue and green. There's a whole sort of culture associated with How Long Gone, I think, and it has a really clear place in the sort of zeitgeist of today. Of course, there's the famed flagship podcast, but to carry the tote means you're a diehard. And there's something, this is probably the most bicoastal tote of all of them, which is to say that you probably split your time between some sort of very chic Richard Neutra house in Silver Lake in LA or a Tribeca co-op. I feel like this is the kind of person who belongs to San Vicente Bungalows in West Hollywood, the exclusive industry insider members club, but probably doesn't go that often because they live on the east side in Silver Lake. But I bet they're already on the list for the new one that is opening at some future point this year in New York. So again, very bicoastal. I feel like this is also the kind of person who wears a lot of Bodhi, the New York darling brand, as well as Jacques Marie Mage sunglasses, manages to wedge in that word bicoastal into most conversations.
Harrison, I think this is going to go down in morning meeting history as one of the most esoteric, potentially snobby, but I mean that in a great way, episodes we've ever done.
I love that. I love that I can be the bearer of snobbery.
But I think we should say that we say this all in love. We love all of you and we love all of your media totes. There's room for all of them.
Well, of course, I should also add that as the communications director of Airmail, this is near and dear to my heart, given that I deal with the press very often. And these are friends and family in many cases.
Harrison, what does it mean about me if I'm like the guy who the closest I come to a tote is using like one of those reusable Tyvek Fresh Direct bags? What does it say about me?
Michael, I hesitate to even explain to you what that means. If you have to ask. To
me, it's like it's the anti. On the other side, like, I'm not even going to pretend I know that. So that's my flex. Anyway.
Sure.
I'll keep telling myself that.
Yeah, exactly.
Harrison, what do you make of this trend we're seeing in London in which the hipsters are carrying around Trader Joe's canvas totes? Do you have a view?
Oh my God. I'm so glad you asked. This, in my mind, is one of those trends that as it crosses the Atlantic, it just totally distorts what it would be on one side of the Atlantic to the other, right? So it's similar to, there was a period where a lot of French people, sort of Parisians, I want to say 10-ish years ago, were wearing Franklin and Marshall college sweatshirts. I don't know why. It may have been a brand. We'll need to do some more investigation of this, but there was this very funny trend of reappropriating some very sort of middle of the road. I mean, it's a great university and whatever, but it wouldn't be one that you would expect a big international community to be aware of. And this, in my mind, is kind of that thing where Trader Joe's has a clear place in the culture. I wouldn't necessarily say it is a sort of Erewhon or even a Whole Foods, really, for that matter. And yet it has managed to subvert its own reputation as it crosses the Atlantic. And I just totally love it. I think it's great and a very funny sort of transatlantic dialogue.
Harrison, like, if only you guys had an idea of how desperately I miss that salsa.
We'll bring some for you next time we're in London, Ashley.
Please do.
Harrison, if this PR thing doesn't work out for you, you've got a very good career as a cultural anthropologist. So
I love that. I think I'll have to add that to the CV.
Harrison, thank you so much. Can't wait to see how this is going to play out on TikTok. Get ready.
Thanks so much, guys. We shall see.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
There's only one place to discover a global snapshot of the current cultural scene. Airmail's Arts Intel Report. Our international research tool for what to do and where and when to do it is user-friendly, continuously updated, and meticulously curated. Arts Intel is handy at home, on the road, and when you're planning your next trip. It also includes indispensable lists of restaurants and hotels in key cities around the world, recommended by our well-traveled experts. Explore Arts Intel at airmail.news/arts-intel, and be sure to sign up for our Week in Culture newsletter, which is published every Wednesday afternoon at airmail.news/WIC. I'm Chris Garrett, Airmail Deputy Editor, and I never leave home without it. Bon voyage.
Do you even carry a bag, Michael?
Of course, I do have my airmail tote that I carry when I travel, and I always get great compliments on it, envious compliments on how to get it, which I'm happy to refer people. But sort of running around the city day to day, I have a very large airmail tote, so it's really sort of like a weekend bag. So, like I say, day to day, not so much. And you, my dear, how about you?
I do. I carry my airmail tote largely when I'm traveling. And then around the city, I either have a tiny little, but I don't usually carry a tote around the city, it turns out. Although I guess I probably should, maybe. Harrison's making me think I need all these totes, frankly.
Is there a River Cafe tote?
There is a River Cafe tote. I do take my River Cafe tote grocery shopping because it's absolutely massive and you can fit everything in it.
There you go. See?
Yeah, you do. You knew me. I feel seen.
Who else sees you the way I see you?
Nobody does, Michael. And this is why you've got to get back to London. Facts are facts.
Facts are facts.
Well, on that note, it is the weekend. There is lots to watch, plenty of sporting events, the Olympics, but I know you've got something you can suggest to us to kill the time.
Well, yeah, of course, the Olympics. And the one I wanted to bring up, you and I were both at the Airmail newsstand last week, a conversation for the acclaimed chef Rene Redzepi of Noma and his new documentary on Netflix called Omnivore. Ashley, have you seen it yet?
I haven't. It's really embarrassing, but after listening to Renee speak about it, it's certainly on my watch list.
I happened to catch the first 2 episodes. It's called Omnivore. It's on Apple Plus. And fascinating, when Renee spoke with us, he said sort of the inspiration for it was the great David Attenborough nature series, Planet Earth. And it's as beautiful and lush and moving as that acclaimed series was. In it, Redzepi looks at 5 or 6 different ingredients around the world, from tuna to coffee to rice, and takes us through how they go from market to our table and what it means for us as a culture. So it's terrific. It's beautiful, very inspiring, and I would say don't watch it on an empty stomach because it's going to make you very hungry. It's called Omnivore, and it is on Apple TV+. And you, my dear?
I'm going to recommend going to Noma. And I say this because I don't actually love these long multi-course Michelin-starred meals simply because I don't have the attention span to sit through them. But I will say I went to Noma earlier this year with a friend of mine. It was one of our sort of bucket list things. First of all, we love the city of Copenhagen and it's an eternal source of inspiration. But we wanted to go to Noma because it is going to be closing at the end of ocean season, which is sort of the winter in 2025. And every element of that experience was special. From the moment that we showed up, to sort of walking through the gardens, walking past the building, walking through the door that was decorated with all of these shells. I mean, it was just such a special creative place. It was kind of like walking into a painting. So if you were to say, do you like a tart made of fish eyes? Is that the kind of thing you like to eat? I'd say probably not. But at Noma, it's such a creative exercise that it's really hard not to marvel at what they're doing there and just to sort of see how food is often about so much more than food and how using these ingredients is just a different way of creative expression. So even if you don't like to eat anything at all, it's still a really interesting place just to go and to watch how these people work. I found it really inspiring. And it was 6 hours of great conversation with my friend, but also just marveling at the way that these people work and the ideas that they have and their willingness and enthusiasm for experimentation. So if you've been on the fence about whether or not you should try to wrangle tickets and an invitation or whatever to Noma, like by all means, I'd really recommend trying to make it happen if you possibly can, because it's sort of a limited time engagement at the moment.
I think people might be DMing or asking you to help them get reservations, but
they keep a wait list. They keep a wait list and things move. You just have to be flexible in terms of when you go. So get your name on the wait list because things happen. It's definitely worth the flight. It's very easy to get there from London, but also there's some really incredible hotels there. We stayed at a place called Villa Copenhagen, which was very well priced. I think it was like under $300 a night, something like that. But we absolutely loved it. They had great breakfast. It's a really fun city for a weekend away. I know it's difficult to get there from the US, but certainly from the UK or from France or any of these places in Europe, it's just a 2-hour flight and you feel like you're in such a different universe. And there's so many great restaurants and vintage shops and museums. There's just an awful lot to do.
You've made me hungry and made me want to go.
We go together. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. We wish you a wonderful weekend. Michael, will you please read us out?
Morning Meeting is produced by Airplay Productions and edited by Jesse Cannon. Our co-editors are Graydon Carter and Alexander Stanley. Our chief operating officer is Bill Keenan, and our deputy editors are Ashley Baker, Chris Garrett, Nathan King, Julie Vitale, and Ash Carter. Our CMO is Emily Davis, and our music supervisor is Randall Poster. Our theme music is The Cute Monster by the Buddy Collette Quintet. A new edition of Airmail is published every Saturday, so please subscribe and enjoy all of our stories on airmail.news, which we update every day, but you can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Airmail Weekly. We will be back here next Saturday with another edition of Morning Meeting, but in the meantime, be sure to subscribe at Spotify or Apple Music. But most of all, thank you again for joining us.